Hey, if you're a podcaster, you might want to check out Anchor by Spotify, the platform I use to host and distribute this very show. If you haven't heard about Anchor, they describe their platform as the easiest way to make a podcast, with all the basics you need in one place. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right on your phone or computer. Of course, you could be like me and do things the hard way by pre-recording and editing your audio somewhere else, but Anchor also makes it easy to upload that audio too. Anchor also distributes your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a bunch I had never even heard of. The fact that they kind of do all that stuff for you is really nice. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I'm Jed Cole, and you are inside the text. And I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. He opened the shaft of the abyss, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. It is no longer canon that, after his death, Anakin Skywalker's Force spirit visits Leia Organa, his daughter, to ask her for forgiveness. It is no longer canon that ace pilot Wedge Antilles reforms the legendary Rogue Squadron into a fighter pilot/commando team, and with the help of Black Sheep Corran Horn, helps take the city planet of Coruscant as the new capital of the fledgling New Republic. It is no longer canon that, in a bid to win Leia's heart after she agrees to a political marriage to a dashing prince, Han Solo wins a planet in a sabacc game and whisks the princess away there, where they of course encounter a band of Force witches. It is no longer canon that Han and Leia get married after said adventure and have a child named Anakin. It is no longer canon that Luke Skywalker establishes his Jedi Academy in the jungles of Yavin 4, taking among his students none other than Han and Leia's now 3 children, Anakin, Jason, and Jaina. It is no longer canon that Luke Skywalker himself gets married to his would-be murderer, Mara Jade, the late Emperor Palpatine's personal assassin. It is no longer canon that the beloved Wookiee Chewbacca is tragically killed when Cern Padal's moon is pulled into a collision course with the planet, leaving Han Solo and my teenage heart bereft. These fictional events from what was once known as the Star Wars Expanded Universe were re-canonized as of April 25th, 2014 under the heading Star Wars Legends, as Disney prepared the franchise for a new trilogy of sequels. In a press release making the announcement, StarWars.com justified the canonical reset as giving, quote, maximum creative freedom to the filmmakers and also an element of surprise and discovery for the audience. The Expanded Universe, or EU, lapsed into Legends, a collection of myths and pseudepigrapha, as it were, parallel literary worlds of a now non-factual fictional universe, which, don't get me wrong, are still sold. Throughout my teen and preteen years, I'd bring home entire grocery bags full of Expanded Universe novels from my grandpa's collection. Just inside the covers of most of these books, there'd often be a multi-page table listing all the novels published up to the year the particular book came out. These listings were arranged in chronological order, their place in the canonical timeline indicated by so many years before or after the Battle of Yavin, BBY or ABY respectively, a reference to the timing of the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, which came out in 1977. I used this list as a guide for what to read next as I made my way through fictional canonical time. I didn't like to jump ahead if I could help it. When I went to the bookstore, I would go to the Star Wars shelf and look at all the novels that my grandpa didn't have. But there weren't just novels. There were toys, role-playing games, radio dramas, video games, comic books, picture books like The Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, with illustrations and detailed descriptions of all the vehicles named in the novels and movies that I studied as if it were a textbook. And of course, there were TV shows like Clone Wars and straight-to-TV movies like 1984's The Ewok Adventure, which I watched on recorded VHS at my grandpa's house, along with its 1985 sequel, The Battle for Endor, which I think we can all agree was the inferior of the two.
Somebody does live in here. They sure are messy. Yep, messy.
According to Wikipedia, the be-all, end-all Star Wars fan wiki, the Expanded Universe/Legends canon encompasses 6 TV shows and straight-to-TV films, almost a dozen radio dramas, between 155 and over 400 novels and books, depending on who you ask and how you count, more than 150 video games, and that's leaving out a veritable ocean of toys with their canonizing flavor text, board games, and multiple role-playing games, each of course with their own canon-packed source books. Each of these licensed properties established canonical facts of greater or lesser import and authority. For example, it is in the novelization of the first film, written by Alan Dean Foster and published a full 6 months before the movie came out in May 1977, that Darth Vader is referred to as a Sith Lord, and the Galactic Emperor named Palpatine, terms that don't actually appear on screen until The Phantom Menace in 1999. As Gerry Canavan puts it in his study of Star Wars and its relationship to the EU, the films never really stood entirely on their own, but rather have been augmented by what he and other media scholars call paratexts, quasi-authoritative and quasi-reliable information sources such as interviews, promotional materials, trailers, fan works, adaptations into prose, radio and comics, flavor text on action figures, etc. These paratexts, Canavan says, complicate and at times rewrite the terms of the universe established by the original films, sometimes intentionally and sometimes haphazardly. Quoting the work of Jonathan Gray, Canavan even goes so far as to argue that a text like Star Wars cannot be adequately studied without taking into account its multitude of proliferations in entertainment media. The trailers, spin-offs, toys, games, merchandise, parodies, amusement park rides, and novels that serve not just as extensions of the primary text, but as, quote, originary filters through which we must pass on our way to the film or program. An example is Boba Fett, whose popularity originally stemmed from his debut as a mail-in promotional action figure a whole year before he appeared in Empire Strikes Back, in which he is never actually mentioned by name. But actually, his first appearance on screen was in 1978's Star Wars Holiday Special.
Maybe I can help you. I am Boba Fett.
Which is seen now as strictly non-canonical for infamous reasons. However, Fett was also present as part of a parade in San Anselmo, California a month before that. This, too, is a paratext. Between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Boba Fett has about 6.5 minutes of screen time. Now, he has his own spin-off show on Disney+.
Jabba ruled with fear. I intend to rule with respect.
The Book of Boba Fett.
But surely not all of these texts bear the same canonical reliability. Before the reset in 2014, Star Wars and the EU was governed by a hierarchy of canonicity that was derived from Lucas Licensing's internal reference system, dubbed the Holocron, the name for a polygonal information storage device that first appeared in an Expanded Universe comic book by Tom Veitch and Cam Kennedy. Lucas Licensing archivist Leland Chee, called by fans the Keeper of the Holocron, tweeted October 28, 2021 that the Holocron database contained nearly 98,000 entries, including thousands of texts and tens of thousands of images, characters, and planets. Pre-2014, this content, as Canavan outlines in his study, was divided into ranked tiers of canonical authority. At the top was G-Canon, or George Canon, which included anything sourced from the original 6 Star Wars movies by George Lucas. The messaging behind the canon reset reinscribed this authority, referring to these stories as, quote, the immovable objects of Star Wars history, the characters and events to which all other tales must align. The next step down in the ranking of EU authority was T-Canon, or television canon, including any TV shows except the 2008 Clone Wars series, which George Lucas created, putting it technically under the G-Canon umbrella. A step lower was C-Canon, encompassing almost all the officially licensed works in the expanded universe, including many of the things I have cataloged so far. Lower still was S-Canon, including what Canavan calls, quote, specially deprecated C-Canon works like the Star Wars Holiday Special. And finally, there's N-Canon, or not canon, which includes extraneous paratexts like that time Luke, C-3PO, and R2-D2 appeared on episode 417 of The Muppet Show.
Seems we've landed on some sort of comedy variety show planet.
Any canon worth its salt embodies a host of contradictions its interpreters must somehow try to resolve, not least for the Star Wars expanded universe, whose outer limits stretched from thousands of years before the events of the original film to some 125 years afterward. As a result, the EU is kind of wild. Canavan inventories some of the ways in which EU stories just redid stuff from the original movie trilogy over and over, almost to the point of absurdity, counting at least 66 instances of Death Star-esque superweapons, including another Death Star, the Sun Crusher, the Planet Killer, the World Devastator, the Hyperspace Nullifier, the Sunraiser, the Planet Prison, the Dark Saber, the Dark Reaper, the Galaxy Gun, the Silencer, and others. Emperor Palpatine is revealed to have cloned himself dozens of times, bodies spread across the galaxy, allowing him to return as a villain in the EU over and over. On the other hand, Canavan observes that it is also in the realm of the EU where Star Wars is treated most seriously as a work of science fiction, as opposed to fantasy. For example, the EU asks, wouldn't that cloud of fiery metal debris from the second Death Star explosion cause a mass extinction event on the home moon of the Ewoks? Answer, maybe, if the Death Star's hyperspace regulator hadn't sucked most of the debris through a wormhole when it exploded, scattering it across the galaxy. Duh. The EU is also full of development in directions the films commonly eschewed. In the EU, we got to see Han Solo mature into a semi-responsible husband and father. In the EU, we first saw people who were not men become Jedi. In the EU, we first encountered villains like Grand Admiral Thrawn, who went beyond the exaggerated fairy tale evil of the likes of Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, demonstrating much more complex motivations for their actions. On the other hand, the expanded universe taken as a whole was pretty heckin' grim. In Canavan's words, quote, a brutally bleak rumination on the tragic arc of history and the inability of social forms to ever progress past violence and collective misery. Canavan wonders further whether this might explain the relative willingness the majority of fans expressed at letting that expanded universe pass into Legends. Maybe the Disney canon reset would prove to suspend this, quote, anti-utopian nightmare and offer a more hopeful narrative. 8 years later, it would seem like not so much. The sequel trilogy opens with a New Republic that was never able to truly eradicate the Empire, much less establish a utopian society embodying the return of the Jedi's ideals, and concludes with a twofold resurgence, revealing that the evil Emperor, Sith Lord Palpatine, surprise, surprise, cloned himself back into existence. Given the trajectory of the sequel trilogy, despite the brilliant metacritique of The Last Jedi, and looking at the trajectory of the spin-off films and streaming series, Canavan concludes that what seems to have been the real problem with the EU, for Disney, was not its political narrative or its recombination of film ideas, but rather its profitability in an oversaturated marketplace. Canavan uses the word bottomless to describe the canonical arc of the Star Wars EU. The renovated post-2014 Star Wars canon has shown itself to be perhaps equally so, but with more corporate strategy involved. One might call it abyssal. Hey there, human. Did you know that you can now support my work on Patreon? It's true. At patreon.com/JedCole, you can chip in to help me make cool stuff for cool humans such as your cool self. You've got 3 tiers of support to choose from, each with very cheesy names on a theme. For just $3, you can become a co-thinker, getting you early access to ad-free episodes. You also get access to bonus episodes about, say, 18th century robot con artists, and other things that I write on the pressing issues of our times, such as the philosophical questions raised by pondering one's orb. For just a couple dollars more, you can become a co-interpreter, getting you everything in the first tier, but also access to scripts before I start recording, so you can offer feedback. I also give you a shout out by name in each episode. For a measly 10 buckaroos, you can achieve the status of co-textualist, giving you not only access to early content, scripts, and shoutouts, but also access to research notes, outlines, as well as music I compose for the show. A lot of hours go into each episode of Inside the Text, and contributions from humans like you help make this show possible. So yeah, head over to patreon.com/JedCole, that's JEDDCOLE, to learn more and hopefully sign up. Thanks. They have as king over them the Angel of the Abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. What is canon? According to Mike Rugnetta, canon encompasses roughly, quote, the set of facts which comprise what is officially the case in any given fiction. On the flip side, canon excludes that which is not true in the fiction, that which contradicts what is the case, or that which simply doesn't come up within the scope of the fiction. It is canon that in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, the 7-piece band playing in the Mos Eisley Cantina is called Figrin Dawn and the Modal Nodes, and that the popular soiree music which they are performing is of a genre called jizz. But it is not, strictly speaking, canon that Kylo Ren, leader of the neo-fascist First Order, enjoys listening to jizz music in his downtime. Canon also tends to exclude fanon and headcanon, the individual elaborations and riffs of fans who attempt to extend or write against the grain of a given fiction. What counts as canon depends to a great extent then on who is speaking. Official canon, Rugnetta explains, is primarily built up from what he calls landmark works, the books, movies, TV episodes, etc., which one could say establish the basis for the story in question. Fans often respond with their own canonical interpretive propositions, but the original creators have the option of acknowledging these interpretations as canonically true or not. This play of interpretative discourse is a commonplace phenomenon when it comes to narrative media, but it is at this juncture where Rugnetta argues canon becomes something else, namely an abyss. What makes canon abyssal, Rugnetta says, stems from the complications that arise whenever authors start basically writing fan fiction about their own works. Rugnetta's essay starts off with the antics of a certain transphobic English author of wizard fictions who will remain unnamed, and her penchant for writing and often tweeting tasty little morsels of world building that cannot but complicate that which is the case in the canonical universe her fans enjoy, and over which she seems to preside. One such excursus, propagated by Pottermore in 2019, explaining that before the advent of bathrooms, the wizardly denizens of Hogwarts simply, quote, relieved themselves wherever they stood and vanished the evidence, is for Rugnetta an apparently trivial tidbit that nevertheless reveals itself with the slightest inspection to be a yawning, bottomless pit of troubling, hygienic, metaphysical, political, and ideological questions. Was said ejecta vanished in process or upon full completion? Rugnetta asks, along with a slew of Harry Potter fans. Did wizards have varying preferences about which waste removal spells were ideal or proper? How tumultuous was the transition from enchanted removal to mundane plumbing? Were there feces vanishing holdouts? Could a wizard vanish excreta directly from their innards? The intriguing problem with paratexts like the one about feces removal for Rugnetta is that each new canonical flourish, each aftermarket authorial augmentation, forces a rearrangement of our understanding of the whole, prompting an ever-branching series of questions that ultimately can never be answered. Because of the authoritative nature of canon, we're goaded into ravenously consuming a breadcrumb trail of pseudo-facts until it inevitably ends, leaving us hungering for more, but ultimately lost in the canonical dark, dutifully waiting at the author's feet for them to dole out more quote-unquote knowledge. Each new morsel, in turn, leads us deeper and deeper. Rugnetta suggests, therefore, that the abyss of canon can be conceived as something like, quote, an endless swirling void of all, even mutually exclusive possibility, a depth of creation and contradiction in which we may search for unknowable answers and lose something of ourselves in the process, or perhaps willingly give it away. Whereas Rugnetta's focus is on the author, literally she who has authority over a given canon, I am interested in what happens when the author function is appropriated and inhabited by a corporate body, say Lucasfilm Limited or the Walt Disney Company. The Star Wars Expanded Universe also comprised a body of canonical knowledge following the contours of Lucas Licensing's management of intellectual property. In the official Star Wars Insider magazine, to which I was a subscriber in my teen years, there was a department near the back where first Pablo Hidalgo and then Leland Chee answered questions about and attempted to resolve contradictions between canonical breadcrumbs, an at times rabbinical process of archival and exegetical acrobatics. Why can there only be 2 Sith? Why do droids all act like living, breathing people even though they're machines? Why did Boba Fett change the color of his dad's ship, the Slave One? What do the letters on Darth Vader's chest box mean? How do energy shields work? Was Jabba's giant man-eating rancor sourced from the planet Dathomir? Do lightsaber cuts instantly cauterize the blood of the wound? And if so, why is there so much blood when Obi-Wan cuts off Ponta Baba's arm in the Mos Eisley Cantina? What's interesting about the case of the Star Wars EU was the paradox of diminishing canonicity with its descending hierarchy of authority. Canavan points out that, quote, the more invested fans became in Star Wars fandom, the less certain they could be that the knowledge they had about the series was actually true. Indeed, the most devoted fans, consuming the most obscure and hard-to-find material, would necessarily encounter less and less authoritative material the deeper into the fandom they went. Since 2014, the recanonization of the Star Wars universe serves to level this hierarchy, at least to a degree, ensuring that a greater proportion of what fans encounter can be reliably incorporated into the canonically factual. The abyss, however, remains, precisely because Star Wars, like the Wizarding World, the MCU, Star Trek, and many other franchises besides, is not just a fiction. In addition, it styles itself as a universe, suggesting, Rugnetta says, quote, coherence, continuity, however fluid, and a set of laws adhered to across all works which bear the same brand. Even if we know where such a universe begins, presumably the author in some shape or form, where does it end? Abyss, in its original Greek form, abyssos, means literally that which is bottomless. Abyssos, no bottom. In his essay, Mike Rugnetta looks at the abyss through, among other lenses, its use in the Greek translation of the biblical book of Genesis, where it is used to describe how, before Earth is formed by the Creator, there is only a vast deep. For our purposes here, however, I'd like to think about the abyss in terms of its, shall we say, native usage, the Greek in which later Christian biblical texts were originally written. In the Apocalypse of John, aka the Book of Revelation, we find the densest concentration of the word abyssos in the biblical canon, referring to an ominous pit that opens amid the tumultuous events of the last days, whose smoke blots out the sun, out of which monsters rise, and into which they finally fall. The Bible has a canon of its own. And not only that, biblical canon is sort of at the root of our modern conceptions of and debates around canon and canonization. I would be remiss while we're on the topic if I didn't point out that the Book of Revelation itself has a contested history within the story of the Christian canon. Among the last of the books to be accepted into what most of us know today as the Christian Bible, the Apocalypse of John has since the beginning been looked upon by some within the broad Christian community with distrust. For example, the Syrian Church, or Church of the East, never recognized it as canonical, and it is the only biblical book not used in liturgical worship by the Eastern Orthodox Church. Why is that?
Why?
Actually, Christians didn't agree on what should count as canonical sacred scripture for literally hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. Bart Ehrman, a scholar of early church history, writes in his book Lost Christianities that it's not until the 390s CE that the quote-unquote proto-Orthodox church eventually settled, if you can call it that, on a body of scripture that matches what we find in the modern Bible. And still, to say there was unanimity among all Christians would be something of a stretch. The wider church read a plethora of texts, many of which do not even survive today. Books like the Secret Gospel of Thomas, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, Synodos, the Book of the Covenant, the Apocalypse of Peter, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla, popular in many early Christian communities and circulated broadly for decades or even centuries, were all eventually deemed unfit for the canon. Ehrman's study shows that the Christian canon was ratified more or less through consensus, with church leaders working from what most believers were already reading and hearing, rather than through some official proclamation from on high. Still, the concern with canonical authority was, and remains, a matter of great importance for the faiths under the Christian umbrella. What was at stake for the early church when it came to the authority of Scripture? As Ehrman reads the situation, the biggest factors forcing the formation of canon lists by the end of the 2nd century were prophetic movements working within the Proto-Orthodox Church and so-called heretical forces working outside it. Side note, by Proto-Orthodox, Ehrman refers to those communities whose beliefs and practices eventually held sway over the Christian mainstream. On the one hand, you had Christians like Montanus and his 2 women companions who claimed to have direct prophetic revelations from God, a practice of inspiration that, if allowed to continue, could be taken up just as easily by heretical as by Orthodox believers. A stable canon would counter the inherent unruliness of inspiration, and so Christian leaders began to emphasize, quote, written authorities, solid and fixed, rather than inspired prophecies in the Spirit, fluctuating and impermanent. On the other hand, you had people like the popular Marcion, whose name also started with an M, and who was the first Christian to promote a fixed list of texts he considered exclusively canonical. Thing is, Marcion was sort of the arch-heretic of the 2nd century, whose canon list reflected his teaching that there were actually 2 gods, not one, and that Jesus was never really human, and that the Apostle Paul was pretty much the only guy you should listen to, besides Marcion himself, that is, and in whose voice and on whose behalf Marcion took the liberty of tweaking some of the books in his biblical canon. In response to these 2 vectors of heterodoxy, one begins to see Proto-Orthodox leaders making canon lists of their own. The Greek word kanon literally refers to a measuring rod, hence a standard. And Ehrman finds Proto-Orthodox authors ultimately adopting a sort of unspoken 4-fold standard for canonical consideration. First, texts had to have been written near the time of Jesus, as close to the divine source as possible. Second, texts had to be written by Jesus' disciples, aka the apostles, or at least their companions. Third, texts had to enjoy a certain widespread usage among the Proto-Orthodox community writ large. And last but not least, texts had to reflect what was judged as correct theology. As you can imagine, evaluating a given text along these lines is and always has been fraught. The practice of canonization in the early church was thus a practice of taking disparate things, texts written in various places at various times by various people to various ends, and seeing in them a kind of authoritative unity. Just as there was one true deity and one true savior, it made sense that there should be one true teaching, and hence one true standard for textual authority. A typical early example of this view is found in a festal letter by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, written in 367, which, after listing the canonical books, declares that, quote, "In these alone the teaching of godliness is proclaimed. Let no one add to these, let nothing be taken away from them." The letter then admits that there are other books out there which are not canonical, but are allowed to be, quote, merely read. Books like The Wisdom of Solomon and The Shepherd of Hermas, which had enjoyed a wide readership for a long time. But, he goes on, there are yet other books he calls secret writings or apocrypha, which are strictly non-canonical, written by heretics who he says make things up and pass them off as authentic. Biblical fan fiction, as it were. Another side note here, we can see a precedent right here for the hierarchical tiers of diminishing canonicity we saw earlier with the Star Wars holocron system. In Ehrman's analysis, the early biblical canon was the fruit of a more or less collective process, at least among authority figures, a process of consensus and contestation. It took hundreds of years for the bulk of the modern Bible to reach a broadly agreed upon composition, but the debates on the margins of said bulk never really stopped. In contrast, the notion of fictional canon formation we're trying to get at is more akin to the top-down theology of modern evangelical Christians, among others, for whom the biblical canon is authoritative not because, or at least not just because, the Orthodox community has deemed it so over time, but because it is a priori assumed to be transmitted directly or indirectly through inspiration from on high, from the mind not of an author, but the author, God. Or, in the case of Star Wars, George Lucas, Lucas Licensing, or Disney, depending on the circumstances. Both models, however, have the same goal: to present an authoritative body of texts, unified in voice, universal in scope. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the abyss will make war on them, and conquer them, and kill them. In Peering into the Abyss of Canon, Mike Rugnetta draws on an article by Carolyn Bishop, who analyzes the paratextual shenanigans of our aforementioned wizardly writer as those of an undead author. This idea itself riffs on the now well-worn work of Roland Bart, whose 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, argued against prioritizing an author's particular biography, psychology, or intentions when interpreting literature. Instead, Bart says we should approach a text as a multi-layered tissue of quotations, as it were, a matrix whose density necessarily goes beyond even the author's own awareness, a synthesis of sign systems, voices, other texts, and the reader's own reconstruction of it. For Bishop and Rugnetta, an author who insists on ceaselessly commentating on, clarifying, and reinterpreting their textual world, constantly readjusting and in some cases hastily fixing it or shoring up problematic gaps, far from dead, becomes more like a zombie. The paratexts of the undead author, often spread not unlike a virus through social media, usher eager readers into the abyss in a manner akin to advertising, manufacturing desire for something new out of the raw materials of the old. The undead author gibbers for the sake of engagement, relevance, and social and economic capital. Fans, in turn, are bitten, hungering for more canon, something which Rugnetta points out we can neither describe nor properly anticipate. When shown what was missing all along, he says, a sense of need spikes. Wizard feces is the brain chum, and we are the zombie sharks. Many of us come to cherish the abyss, to hope, perhaps, that if we gaze long enough into its depths, it might look back and validate us. What happens, though, when this author function, with its canonical authority, is subsumed within the faceless immensity of a corporation? If authors and fans mutually morph into nomming zombies as they spiral along the eternal funnel of canon's abyss, then we could do worse than to understand corporate canonizers as monstrous necromancers, raising the dead to serve their brands. For example, the Star Wars canon, to return to where we started, cannot be traced back to a single undead author paratextualizing their way across the galaxy, even if George Lucas would like to disagree. Sorry, Daddy. If we recall that the novelization of what would eventually be called A New Hope was published before the film was even released, then we have to admit that the Star Wars canon has, from the beginning, always been of corporate authorship. Since Disney took the reins of the canon in 2014, this has only intensified and consolidated. In 2014, at the same time as it announced that the Star Wars lore would be recanonized, Disney Lucasfilm announced the formation of a new corporate branch called the Story Group, which would oversee and coordinate all Star Wars creative development, such that, quote, all aspects of Star Wars storytelling moving forward will be connected. Since then, Pablo Hidalgo, one of the Story Group's most popular members and author of the visual dictionary books that have accompanied the releases of each movie in the sequel trilogy, became a sort of mouthpiece of canonical clarifications on behalf of the Story Group, answering fan questions on Twitter and in various YouTube shows on a regular basis. As Disney went on to announce plans for an honestly staggering number of new Star Wars properties, movies, streaming TV series, book series, comics, and the like, each new release prompted more and more questions, each new answer from the Story Group leading deeper into the ever-churning abyss. The Story Group was there specifically to anticipate and curate this process in favor of a unified and cohesive canon, an impossible but no doubt profitable task. Whereas canonization is historically a post hoc process of interpretation and reappropriation, Disney's approach with Lucasfilm demonstrates pre-hoc canonization, and maybe this is what differentiates the undead author from the necromantic corporation. The undead author is cursed eternally to fill in the gaps of their fictional universe, always creating new gaps in the process, new answers, spawning new questions, spawning new answers, and so on. The corporate necromancer carefully plans and moderates its universe from the outset. The necromancer attempts to canonize in advance. We can see, though, how the necromancer is playing both sides of this messy game. The brand takes pains to structure and plan its narratives sometimes years in advance, striving on the one hand for a cohesive, gapless, canonical continuity, but on the other hand, it incorporates the abyss into its very marketing structure, commanding a veritable army of authors and curators and sending them out among the consumer base to ensure that the breadcrumbs never cease to fall. The necromantic corporation wants to have its brains and eat them too. What lies behind the impulse to create expanded universes for Gerry Canavan is, quote, the suspension or refusal of death, which is to say, the refusal to allow narratives to progress and reach their conclusions. Ironically, continuity itself can eventually become a threat, Canavan says, to what makes franchises serve as, quote, endlessly renewable, endlessly consumable media properties. The sheer accumulation of universe can eventually, as in the case of Star Wars, grow so vast and so unwieldy that maintaining consistency and profitability becomes a challenge. Star Wars, under the helm of Disney, decided a reboot centered around its most popular landmark works, the original film trilogy and their prequels, would remedy that. Start a new expanded universe, but this time designed for maximal consistency and aimed at converting a new generation of consumers while hewing close enough to the original material so as not to alienate longtime fans. Despite the protestations of Pablo Hidalgo et al., what's left behind, at least in the eyes of some, amounts to a kind of canonical detritus. The old expanded universe technically remains to be consumed, but being no longer canonically true, what good is it save to arouse the occasional nostalgia of a few folks who grew up with it? Disney has taken a different approach when it comes to its Marvel properties. Having already rebooted a host of superheroes under that brand, some of them multiple times, the franchise has since leaned hard into a boiled-down version of multiverse theory to shore up canonical consistency while also allowing itself to reboot characters, a device that's quite at home in the comic book genre. Starting with the incredibly fun Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse in 2018, then continuing with the extremely less fun Avengers Endgame in 2019, Loki and Spider-Man No Way Home in 2021, not to mention upcoming properties like Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. On-screen Marvel superheroes now regularly encounter parallel, yet still officially canonical universes, each story diegetically taking place within merely one of potentially many such timelines.
What do you know about the multiverse?
Rather than having any disruptive effect on the formation of Marvel's canon, however, the apparent multiplicity is, I suspect, just that, apparent. To go deep into the implications of curated fictional multiverses, let alone Disney Marvel's use of them in recent years, is too big a topic to get into here, but my suspicion is that despite the conceit, the multiverse is, at the end of the day, functionally merely a larger universe, a neat method of maximizing ever more properties within the same persistent canon. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the abyss and a great chain, and he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent. Let's hold up a minute. Why criticize? Is the abyss bad? I mean, it sounds bad. Why be worried about the fact that a bunch of people enjoy delving deeper and deeper into fictional universes that seem to give them joy? Why not just let people enjoy things? Well, I am definitely not here to shame anyone. I spent my fair share of hours in this nasty, brutish, and short existence defending the prequel films, for crying out loud. And maybe if canon, taken more broadly, were truly a collective, emergent process where authority was held loosely, where play rather than profit was the final word, we wouldn't be talking about the abyss. But what I'm trying to get at, following the likes of Mike Rugnetta and Gerry Canavan, is a certain troubling, politically cynical tendency that lurks within the moves pop cultural canon tends to make. Said moves tend to be driven, unsurprisingly, by the imperatives of capital, whose zombie progeny, author and fan alike, become both victim and minion, witting or otherwise. But the abyss into which canon leads us doesn't just represent the shuffling undeath of zombie authors and tired franchises milked for all they're worth. Recall Canavan's summary of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, an eternally recurring history of anti-utopia, whose inhabitants, regardless of their heroism, their hopefulness, their oneness with the Force, are never able to progress beyond the violence and social immiseration of empire. That's bleak. And not just bleak, self-defeating. Because of all franchises, Star Wars should be hopeful. After all, it is at its core about people finding the hope, the spirit, the Force, if you will, to join together and defeat their fascist oppressors. What keeps the Star Wars canon from achieving its hopeful, if complicated and imperfect, vision for a victorious end to anti-fascist struggle of freedom for all and redemption of the galaxy? It's the abyss. The abyss of canon is, in the immortal words of Admiral Akbar, a trap.
It's a trap!
Promising ever more content for an ever hungrier fan base, but in the process abdicating the moral and political capacity to really end. There is a specter haunting the abyss. Like all ghosts, this specter yearns more than anything for closure. Closure, however, is not to be confused with foreclosure, which is precisely the mode in which canon abyssalizes itself. Like the serpent Ouroboros, canon eats its own tail. By closing the circle that is itself, it manages to forestall its end. But this is the immortality of the zombie, or the vampire, forever seeking more flesh. A fundamentally static existence, with no purpose but to feed. Which is exactly the MO of capital, that blood-sucking monster that colonizes and entraps the world, knowing nothing but the extension and expansion of itself forever, no matter what it must devour in the process. A story that never ends, or rather, can never be allowed to end. And so, it is precisely ending which haunts the undeath of canon and capitalism alike. If we were to take our cue from the Apocalypse of John, perhaps what we need is an eschatology of canon. Eschatology, derived from the Greek word for last, is a term from the field of theology that deals with visions of the end, typically the end of the world, the eschaton. The eschatology of the Apocalypse of John has to do with the return of Jesus and the defeat of the oppressive Roman Empire, and what the author saw as false religion. A vision of a divine intervention into the affairs of humans and beastly principalities, the climax and resolution of an eons-long war between absolute good and absolute evil. As we've established, the abyss features prominently in this particular story. Out of it come all kinds of overwhelming evils, and into it the devil is finally thrown, so as to isolate and exclude what the author saw as the supernatural root cause of all evil. The angel described as presiding over the abyss is named Abaddon, a word which in the Masoretic Hebrew Bible refers to the realm of the dead. This angel of death opens the lid to the abyss and, one assumes, closes it once all is said and done. Abyssalizing canon does all it can to deny this specter of endings, this angel of death, holding out for the potential of perpetual growth. In doing so, it rejects the growth that only death of a kind can bring. I am talking about endings. Human experience is, in a strict sense, always already in the middle of time, in media res, to use a literary term, subject to a kind of radical contingency. We don't know why we were born when, where we're going, what the story of our existence will be, except that we carry our own deaths within us, each moment bringing us slowly, we hope slowly, toward it. In his book, The Sense of an Ending, literary critic Frank Kermode observes how we fashion stories with plots, with beginnings and ends, to organize and humanize the time in which we find ourselves, to make it make sense, as it were. Narrative endings, by this logic, are always artificial, arbitrary. To write an ending is to make a choice, to leave the audience at a specific point in time. What might happen after this moment is unanswerable by the fiction. The question pivots from what's going to happen next to what does it mean? An end, therefore, by necessity, has a moral, even a political dimension. To perpetually defer the end is to equivocate over any kind of moral engagement with the life which is represented by the story. Kermode makes a distinction between what he calls myths and fictions. Myth operates ritualistically in a sequence of radically unchangeable gestures, an agent of stability, calling for absolute assent to its efforts to make sense not in terms of our world as it is, but a world in some way removed from our own. In the abyss of canon, narrative eschews its responsibility to the specter of endings, instead morphing into an eternal running commentary on itself. An exercise of perpetual world building, where questions about its interpretation of our shared life become at best irrelevant and at worst hostile. Unlike myths, according to Kermode, proper fictions are agents of change, which, if successful, make sense of the here and now. However, fictions can degenerate into myths, quote, whenever they are not consciously held to be fictive. For the purposes of our analysis, we might say that fictions become myths at the edge of canon's abyss. Under this framework, we can sometimes take abyssalized stories and retrieve them as fictions. The Last Jedi, for example, is not just a canonical stepping stone, bringing back beloved characters at choice moments and fashioning lovable new creatures and characters to add to our collective holocron databanks. It is also a story about the dichotomy of cynically ignoring the past because it is distasteful.
Let the past die. Kill it if you have to.
And cynically clinging to
The sacred Jedi text!
Because either option forecloses the potential for redemption. Steve Baxi, in a frankly brilliant video essay about the philosophy of endings, recuperates the fiction from the myth, plucking meaning from the edge of the abyss when he asks,
why is The Last Jedi the best Star Wars movie for me? Because it's asking me point blank to grow beyond the person that needs a Star Wars movie to cope with life.
Coping captures something, I think, about the upshot of canon's penchant for avoiding the engagement with life that ending entails. Steve expands on this in his video.
Every moment we have is counting towards an ending. We don't need closure at this point. We need endings that push us to survive. Indeed, your world can break down precisely because you live on after the death of everything you love. This death can be much more painful and fearful than the prospect of your own death, not least because it is a death you have to survive.
The same dynamic which governs the mythic and the abyssal seems to govern our lived social experience. Capitalism, in a way, is an exercise of canon thinking, imposing, enforcing, living by, and reinscribing strict bounds on imagination, on possibility, and on what counts as trustworthy. Ideology is like Canon and Abyss. In the same way that the answer to Canon's Abyss might be the honest reckoning with the demand posed by the specter of endings, so the answer to the abyss we all live in is a radical break, a social ending in the hope of something better. And fictions have a part to play in getting us there. Thanks so much for listening to Inside the Text. This was a lot of fun to piece together. I highly recommend Mike's and Gerry's essays. You can find links to those and a list of all the sources I used in the show notes. And if you liked today's episode, be sure to check out my Patreon and consider becoming a co-thinker for the price of a cup of coffee. You get access to my writing, bonus episodes, and more. Head over to patreon.com/JedCole for the deets. Shout out to all my patrons whose support helps me make this show. I want to give a special thanks to Daniel Holmberg, Alex Boer, Eli Plaskett, Xavier Ari Oliver, John Bell, and Lauren Groen. The music I composed for today's episode can be found at jedcole.bandcamp.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at inside_textpod and yours truly at Jed Cole. Until next time, may the Force be with you.